Hello and welcome back. You're watching World Talks, where every word matters. I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. Donald Trump was sworn into office and is now the 47th president of the United States. During our special edition today, we focused on what this new presidency and Trump's second term in office is going to spell out for the EU and the rest of the world. Joining me now to try and answer the most burning questions, including what comes next, is Michael Carpenter, former senior director for Europe at the U.S. National Security Council. Thank you so much for joining me on the program. It's a pleasure to have you, especially on a day like this.
Thanks for having me.
So we are looking at the inaugural speech because that was one of the high moments of today's inauguration, and we heard the golden age of America begins right now. America won't allow to be taken advantage of. America's decline is over. Our destiny won't be denied. A lot of big words, a lot of declarations. We've heard about historic orders as well. What are your expectations regarding Trump's presidency and his second term in office based on what we've heard before and what we've seen so far as of today?
Well, it's actually very hard to say. The rhetoric that you heard in the inauguration speech is typical of populists who glorify a bygone past, who cast their nation as being in decline, and who present themselves as being truly the only solution to restore some sort of mythical glory to the country. And that's very much the sort of rhetoric that was used by President Trump in his inauguration speech. But as for his policy choices, look, I mean, we know a few things in terms of what he said he will do. He's going to begin deporting illegal immigrants to the United States. He's going to put in place tariffs on many of our partners, as well as on China and a number of other geopolitical rivals. He is going to take a hard-edged approach to many of our allies, including those in the European Union, demanding that they do more, perhaps even viewing them as competitors rather than as allies. And then as for the rest, it really remains to be seen. This is going to be a very mixed team that he has in place. I suspect that there's going to be a lot of rivalries among those who are in power. Each will purport to transmit the word and interpret the word of their boss as they see fit. But actually, it's going to be up to just one man to decide the policy course of the United States over these next 4 years. And that's going to be, or at least until the next midterm election, that's going to be Donald Trump. So we'll have to watch carefully.
As we're looking at his team, as we're looking at the new administration, there was also the swearing into office of J.D. Vance. This is a part of the inauguration. Would you say that his new administration is cohesive? Because there is a lot of people who are quite a surprise as a nomination for those particular places in the cabinet. What's your opinion on that?
Well, it remains to be seen. It's very hard to say right now. Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, is a very well-known individual, someone who has what I would call traditional Republican views on a range of subjects. He's obviously been very hardline on Cuba, on U.S. relations with Cuba. He's been hardline in terms of his anti-communist stance when it comes to Venezuela and the People's Republic of China, the PRC. But on other issue areas, it's going to be difficult to say exactly where the State Department's policy will land, because, as I said, ultimately all policy in this next administration will be beholden to President Trump and his views, and whether those square with the views of his top advisors and his top cabinet officials remains to be seen. On some issues, for example, like Ukraine, you might find some discrepancies. Perhaps in terms of economic statecraft, you also might find some divergence of views between the president and his top team. But they will sort this all out. And I have no doubt there will be a lot of rivalries and discussions, perhaps even debates and disagreements, as is normal for any administration. But I suspect even more so in this one going forward.
How do you think the new U.S. administration is going to reorder the foreign policy? What are we going to see on that front?
Well, I think one of the key questions is going to be how this administration approaches the task of trying to find a solution to the war between Ukraine and Russia.
Something that wasn't actually mentioned in the inaugural speech. There's been a slight mention of this of the Hamas-Israeli ceasefire, but there was nothing on Ukraine.
That's right, and I think that's deliberate. The members of the Trump team have said that it's perhaps more complicated than they initially realized. Of course, the president famously said that he would resolve the war within a matter of 24 hours. That rhetoric has now shifted to saying that perhaps 100 days is needed. But I think the more that they wade into this issue, the more they're going to discover that some of the promises they've made on the campaign trail in terms of trying to find a durable, just, and lasting resolution are going to be much more difficult to effectuate in practice than in terms of campaign rhetoric. And that's primarily because as much as President Trump has leverage over President Zelensky to bring him to the table by threatening to withdraw or withhold U.S. security assistance, it's going to be much tougher to get Putin to the table to negotiate on anything other than Putin's grand plan, which is, of course, the capitulation of Ukraine and the toppling of the current government in Kyiv. So in order to have a conversation where the United States can actually protect its interests in the region, it's going to have to bring leverage to the table. And so far, it's going to be, this is, of course, day one of the Trump administration, but it's going to be hard to envision how the Trump team brings that leverage to the table without putting forward another supplemental bill that will enable security assistance to flow to Ukraine.
And what do you think could possibly the leverage that Mr. Trump is going to have, to put on the table for Vladimir Putin?
Well, that's exactly my point. We have not heard anything in terms of what kind of leverage the Trump administration is going to bring to bear to compel Putin to negotiate anything other than the capitulation of Ukraine, which is, of course, what he wants. In order to get a ceasefire and perhaps some sort of a lasting resolution to the conflict, the United States is going to have to force Putin to understand that the continuation of this war is futile. I think right now, Putin thinks that he can win this war and that he can outlast the United States and its Western allies. So to reverse that trajectory, and look, Putin is not in a strong position. His economy is weak, and he's going to run low on liquid reserves in terms of his sovereign wealth fund and other assets, probably in the last quarter of this year. But still, the Trump administration is going to have to bring something to the table, whether it's additional security assistance, the threat of additional security assistance, and other sorts of security guarantees that will help Mr. Putin understand that continuing the war is futile. I think right now he doesn't see it that way at all, and I think he thinks he can have his cake and eat it.
And in terms of transatlantic relations, and in terms of security and defense and NATO, do you think that there is a potential that Mr. Trump would actually consider having the U.S. to a certain extent or to a full extent withdraw from the alliance?
Well, look, I don't think this is something that the Trump administration is going to do in the early weeks or months of its tenure in office. Obviously, there has been an undercurrent coming from President Trump for years, if not decades, suggesting that the United States is not getting a good deal out of NATO and that our allies need to contribute more to the defense and deterrence capabilities in the alliance, primarily by spending more money on their defense. So there has been a floor of 2% is sort of the goal that we expect all allies to achieve. It's quite possible that the Trump administration will say that that floor is too low and that we need to raise it, even as high as, say, 5%. Now, that's frankly politically unachievable for most of our European allies. But that's where I expect the discussion on NATO will probably head in the coming months. But again, I don't think this is a day one priority for the Trump administration. So I don't expect any kind of action on NATO, at least for a few months, although this rhetoric will continue, demanding the allies pay more and do more.
What about in terms of economy? Do you think that the EU has actually something to offer in terms of economy, in terms of potential business? I mean, let's not forget that Mr. Trump is a businessman at heart. He's businessman first, and then he's the politician, then he's the president of the United States. Do you think that Europe has something that could potentially interest him in, for example, investments, or something that the two could exchange for him to be more interested in security and defense of the European Union?
Well, certainly the European Union is a huge market for the United States. The two-way trade turnover is enormous. So there are opportunities there for the United States to partner with the EU. The question is whether we, the United States, and this administration in particular, views the EU as a partner with which we want to engage on common interests, such as expanding trade, expanding investment, securing our supply chains.
So considering the administration,
critical minerals.
Do you think this administration is going, considering the current administration that's coming into office, do you think that that this administration is going to see Europe as a potential partner when it comes to economy?
Well, but that's a big question. You know, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, in the Trump one term, in his first term, he famously labeled the EU as a strategic foe of the United States and viewed it primarily as a competitor. And I do expect that there will be tariffs put on the EU at some point early in this administration. So whether we look at the EU as a partner of first resort, as the Biden administration did, and seek to find ways to achieve common interests and common goals, building out the transatlantic economy, or do we see them as a competitor and try to hive off our economy and enact protectionist measures that will restrict the EU's ability to sell into the U.S. market? You know, that's the key question. And I think we'll have to see how it plays out. But of course, the rhetoric, at least from the first Trump administration, was one of viewing the Europeans in a very adversarial light.
A lot of EU officials and EU leaders were pointing in a direction of this inevitable trade war between Europe and the US. However, in the inaugural speech, we did hear about certain tariffs for certain countries, but we did not hear anything about the tariffs for the European Union. What would you say this signifies?
I wouldn't read too much out of what's mentioned in the inaugural speech and what's not. Let's wait to see what happens in the coming months. I'm hoping that the European leaders who have come to the inauguration and those who will be coming to Washington in the coming weeks will get an audience with the president and with his top cabinet officials, and will convince them that there is a rationale for cooperating across the Atlantic, for growing our two-way investment, growing our trade, ensuring that we are competitive vis-a-vis other authoritarian states in the world like China or Russia or any number of other countries, and so that we actually achieve our common interests as opposed to fighting with each other and making the disputes, which, you know, there's always inevitably trade disputes between the U.S. and the EU. But rather than having them dominate the agenda, there's a way to sort of put those off to the side and focus on our common interests.
Thank you so much, Michael Carpenter, former Senior Director for Europe at the U.S. National Security Council. Thank you so much for joining me on such a busy day.
My pleasure.
Pleasure as always. And so this would be all for now here on World Talks, but please do stay tuned as we're going to be back in just a moment with more news and features. So everything you need to be up to date with the latest news.